Yes, would you ask Mr. Marshall to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Marshall, ready to carry on?
Absolutely.
Good, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
Kinnear?
Mr. Marshall, before the break, we were looking at minutes of a meeting in January 2011, which were RBK 0002981. And if we could go back to those minutes and page 3. And paragraph 4.4, it says this, and I quote, "However, there have also been a number of potentially more costly items. In particular, the following recommendations were made in relation to flat entrance doors of all of the enclosed blocks. First bullet point, confirm that each dwelling door is to FR30 standard and is provided with a self-closing device. Consider, where not fitted, the installation of intumescent strips and cold smoke seals to each flat access door." Now, would you agree that the particular issue that was flagged up there was the issue of flat entrance doors?
Yes.
And that the issue is then addressed by TMO and RBKC by a programme to replace flat entrance doors. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And the issue with leaseholders that you refer to in your witness statement and in your evidence earlier on today was whether RBKC could force leaseholders to change their doors if that were necessary. Is that a fair summary?
That's what emerged later during that process. It wasn't the issue immediately.
Well, if we can just deal with that in more detail, and if I could ask you to turn to your second witness statement to the inquiry, which is RBK 0005431/3 and paragraph 7. And there we go. In the beginning of the third sentence, which starts with the word "the committee's function," you say this: "The committee's function was to scrutinise the actions of the executive. The committee had to start from an assumption that the TMO, monitored by council officers and the LFB, would always follow best practice in relation to safety. Health and safety was a specific item on the TMO performance review shared with the committee annually. This was a key mechanism for us to gain comfort on this issue. When a specific fire safety issue was raised at the committee, namely the safety of leaseholder doors, we followed this up repeatedly with questions until we were satisfied with the outcome. Between 2012 and May 2016, when I left the HPSC, as far as I can recall, the issue of leaseholder doors was raised at least 9 times at HPSC meetings. It is important to note that the committee had no power to direct any action, either to council officers or the TMO. Its powers were limited to questioning and publicising the matters before it." Now, could we look at an example of how RBKC handled the leaseholder door issue? And if we could turn first of all to Laura Johnson's report to your committee of the 16th of July 2013, which can be found at RBK 000-32449/11. And there we go, paragraph 8.2, which says that responsibility for enforcement of non-compliant leaseholder flat entrance doors remained unresolved following discussions with London Fire Brigade, LFB, senior managers. And so RBKC were guided by Council's opinion to seek a definitive response from the Department for Communities and Local Government, DCLG. To date, an initial response has been received from DCLG, which indicates that enforcement should be via the Housing Act and not the Regulatory Reform Order. So the issue that Laura Johnson addressed in her report was who should enforce non-compliant flat entrance doors. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's what she was addressing in the report.
And the choice was whether it would be the LFB or RBKC, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And if it were to be RBKC, the correct route would be by exercise of powers under the Housing Act 2004. Is that correct?
I think that's what she's writing here, yes, based on what she'd been told by council.
And were you aware of the fact that RBKC did not exercise its powers under the Housing Act?
In relation to this issue?
Yes.
No.
What would be your response to the suggestion that a failure to exercise powers under the Housing Act 2004 was effectively an abdication of responsibility by the council?
Our key concern was that these doors were replaced, and we were less concerned about the mechanism through which that happened than that it happened. And so when we were receiving these reports talking about whether it was the council's responsibility, whether it was the fire brigade's responsibility, which particular piece of legislation should be used, our response was, this is beyond our competence to know which, but we just want something to be done because this is so important.
Thank you. Now, in scrutinising the actions of the TMO executive, did you ever have cause to refer to RBKC's own health and safety policy?
No, I don't believe I did.
Now, if we look at RBKC's policy, we can look at a 2014 version, which is RBK 001655. Excuse me. Can you remember seeing that document?
No.
Can you remember seeing any health and safety document or health and safety policy published by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea?
No, I can't recollect seeing that.
Do you remember ever being prompted or receiving reminders that the policy had been published or to refer to the policy in any way?
No, I can't remember that.
Okay. Now, if we can turn to page 3 of this document, and if we see their introduction, and the first paragraph under that heading says this, and I quote, "This policy sets out the strategic fire safety vision and objectives of elected members and the executive joint management team. It describes the way in which we effectively manage fire safety based upon British Standard Publication PAS 7, Fire Risk Management System specification." Now, underneath that diagram, there are 4 points emboldened, which say as follows: plan the direction for fire safety management; do, profile the fire risks, organise and implement controls; check that fire safety management is working; act on improving fire safety management. Now, would you agree that as the Scrutiny Committee Chair, you had an important role to check that fire safety management was effective and sufficient? Would you agree with that?
I think my role was the same as every other committee member in that regard.
And is that a yes or a no to the question?
Yes.
And would that involve ensuring that leaseholder doors and any other fire safety related issues had been managed effectively and adequately?
Yes, when an issue arose in relation to fire safety, we took it incredibly seriously.
Could I ask you to turn to page 4 of this document and the definition of its scope under paragraph 2.2, which says this, and I quote, "This policy will apply to all premises where the council has a duty as the employer and or as the responsible person as defined in the order. This policy will also apply to any premises where, by virtue of a contract or tenancy agreement, other parties have duties of the responsible person, but where the council retains landlord responsibilities. A local fire policy for residential housing based on the housing stock risk profile will be put in place by the Housing and Regeneration Department." Now, that definition of scope suggests that the policy would apply to the stock managed by the TMO, whether as a responsible person or as a landlord. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
The reference to a local fire policy, can you help us? What was that referring to there? It's in the third subparagraph under 2.2.
I'm not aware of which policy. I understand what it's referring to, but I can't think of the policy itself.
You can't remember it being the subject of any consideration by your committee at any stage?
No, it was never raised.
Could I ask you to turn to page 5 and the 4th paragraph on that page, which starts with the words, "The council has appointed." And the paragraph says this, and I quote, "Council has appointed corporate health and safety team to provide competent advice and to assist in the implementation of an appropriate management system. The team profiles the organisational fire safety risks which inform the strategic direction, business planning process and audit programme. A risk register is maintained and reviewed on a routine basis. The corporate health and safety team will ensure that there are appropriate processes in place to ensure our partner organisations have suitable and sufficient fire safety management systems in place as part of the due diligence procedures, and will develop suitable protocols with partners so as to ensure fire safety compliance is assured. Now, that paragraph is clear that the Council has its own health and safety team, which can provide competent advice and assistance. Would you agree?
Yes.
And would you agree that that advice was available to partner bodies such as the TMO?
I would presume so. I don't believe I ever interacted with this team.
Did you ever have reason to ask whether the TMO had received or sought advice from the Council's in-house health and safety team?
No.
Now, if we can turn over the page to page 6 and paragraph 2.5, under the heading of responsibilities of elected members, it says this, and I quote, "A cabinet member for each borough will be nominated to lead on health and safety matters. Elected members will ensure that health and safety is adequately considered when making decisions at a strategic level. This will be through an annual report on the health and safety profile of the organisation, provided for public scrutiny at the appropriate scrutiny committee for each sovereign borough." Now, looking at that last sentence in particular, would you agree that this policy envisages a substantive role for scrutiny committees in considering health and safety policy and its implementation?
Yes, it clearly says that the report should go to an appropriate scrutiny committee.
And that would include ensuring that RBKC and TMO had adhered to their relevant fire safety policies.
I'm not sure I'm following how that leads on from the paragraph, sorry.
Well, that's what I'm asking you, whether you agree with that or not. It sounds to me that you don't. Is that your answer?
No. I would presume an annual report would indeed include comprehensive information on health and safety.
Can we turn to page 13 and paragraph 4.1? And if you look at the third paragraph under 4.1, which starts with the words "all incidents," and I quote, "All incidents should be reported using the online system. Incidents should be investigated by the manager. Consideration should be given to any system solutions to avoid future recurrence. Corporate health and safety will investigate serious incidents when enforcing bodies such as LFIPA are or may be involved." Were you aware of that particular provision?
No.
Would it have been open to you to have asked the Council to provide an update on what, if any, regulatory notices the Council or the TMO had received from LFIPA?
It would have been open to us to ask.
Can you remember, in relation to fire safety, ever asking for such a list?
No.
Did you ever have cause to ask officers for any information in relation to any regulatory action taken that fell within the purview of the Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee?
So we did, in relation to the fire in October, November 2015. I'm recalling that's
the Adair Tower fire.
It is indeed. And there was regulatory action after that, which was reported to us in January, I think, 2016.
We'll come on to that in due course, but you can't remember in relation to any other aspect of your committee's functions ever asking for details of regulatory action taken by regulatory authorities?
No, my recollection is that there was never anything highlighted to us that there had been regulatory action taken.
Now, in 2014, you were sent links to 2 further guidance documents, and the links were sent by Laura Johnson on the 17th of July 2014. Now, we can go to that email just so you know what I'm talking to, and that's RBK quadruple 03314. And there you go, addressed to you. And she annexes the 2 documents. Now, at paragraph 9 of your second statement, we don't need to go to it unless you want to, you say you don't recall the email or your reaction to it. Could I take you to these 2 guidance documents and then see whether, and if so, to what extent you remember their contents? The 2 guidance documents we're going to be looking at, first of all, the Councillor Guide on Fire Safety for Use During State Visits and Councillor Guide on Fire Safety for Use During Council Meetings. Can you remember the title of either of those guidance documents?
No, the only familiarity I have with these documents is having seen them subsequent to the fire in preparation for today.
Now, could we look at the estate visits guidance, first of all, which is at LFB quadruple 01294. Now, a number of witnesses have been taken to this document. It has the distinctive question mark photograph on the right-hand side. And you'll see that the guide prompts certain questions, and they can be seen in the bottom left-hand corner, set out under 2 bullet points. And those questions are, where is the risk assessment for this building? How often is it reviewed? Who carries out these risk assessments, and what are their qualifications? And if we could look at the right-hand side under the title, Confirming the Emergency Evacuation Plan is in Place, we see what is set out there. Rather than me read it out, could I ask you just to refresh your memory and skim read those words? And when you've reached the word maintained in the bottom right-hand corner, ask the document manager to turn the page. If you go to the final bullet point, is emergency lighting and signage in place along the escape route. Now, did you appreciate at any time during your tenure on the HPSC that there should be an emergency plan in place for a building whether or not stay put applied?
Sorry, is your question about the emergency plan or the stay put?
Emergency plan. The question was this, and I repeat, did you appreciate that there should be an emergency plan in place irrespective of whether stay put applied?
Not explicitly. I would have thought implicitly.
Why do you think implicitly? What was the basis for that belief?
It would be common sense that there should be an evacuation plan for a building.
Bearing in mind it was common sense, could I ask you to turn to the first page of this guide and the questions in the bottom left-hand corner? Did you ask any or all of those questions in relation to any building in the housing stock of the TMO?
No.
Can we look at the council meetings guidance, which is LFB quadruple 01295? And if I could ask you to turn to the second page of the document, and you'll see at the top of the page in the grey box the question, what can councillors do? And then it gives advice, and it says this, and I quote, "Do not make assumptions that fire safety is being actively or effectively managed in purpose-built blocks of flats and maisonettes in your borough. Councillors can make their boroughs safer by scrutinising how responsibilities for fire safety are met and ensuring that the fire safety in your borough is continuously being monitored and improved." Now, what did you do, whether in your capacity as an elected member or a member of the Housing Scrutiny Committee, what did you do to test what assumptions were being made in respect of the active or effective management of fire safety by the TMO?
Directly of the TMO, I don't think, other than through questioning them at committee in relation to all matters, including fire safety.
Can you remember any specific questions or issues on which you tested the assumptions of the TMO via questioning?
Not off the top of my head.
And now if we de-amplify that page and look further down at this page, and it sets out, sorry if we can see the entire page, you'll see in the bottom third there are questions that are asked, where are the risk assessments? Are councillors told that the local authority is subject to enforcement? Thirdly, what contractual relationships are in place, etc. Now, just looking at those questions set out there, Mr. Marshall, did you ever ask any or all of those questions in relation to the TMO housing stock?
No, I don't believe any of us did.
at any time?
Not directly. We relied very heavily on the papers we received and the assurance when you looked at the health and safety aspect of them that everything that is required to be done had been done.
Was this guidance, can you remember, once you'd received it from Laura Johnson, did you circulate it further to all members of your committee?
No, I don't recollect receiving this email.
Is that a no answer to the question, therefore?
Yes.
Well, can you remember? You don't remember receiving the email,
No.
and therefore I suppose you can't remember what you did in response to it, assuming you did receive it.
Indeed.
That's probably as far as you can go, is it?
It is. I
Yeah.
have no recollection of receiving the email.
No.
I, of course, racked my brains before coming here today to try and remember it, but I genuinely can't.
No, that's understand.
Put differently, did you ever have cause to refer to these two guidance documents in your later deliberations on the scrutiny committee, i.e. after 2014?
No.
Could we go back to your first witness statement, to paragraph 44, where you refer to a paper that was prepared for an HPSC meeting on the 13th of May 2015, and the paper was prepared by Laura Johnson. Now, that is at RBK 000-29084. And you see under 1.2, and the last sentence of that subparagraph, as you say in your statement, the number of households with non-compliant doors had dropped to 2. Do you see that?
I do.
Then if we can go on to 1.5, which starts at the bottom of this page, it says this, and I quote, KCTMO's programme of fire risk assessments is ongoing, continues to consider the compliance of flat entrance doors as they form an integral part of the means of escape from the block. The FRA highlights any flat doors which are potentially non-compliant. At that stage, and we're looking at 2015, were you concerned that it had taken so much time to reduce the numbers of non-compliant doors?
Yes, and that was the reason why we kept returning to this subject, to encourage action. Along that journey, there were definite points where we were told that there were impediments to that, and our questions were always, well, how are we going to find solutions? We can't leave it there.
Now, if we can look, following up that comment, can we now turn to the minutes of the meeting on the 13th of May, which can be found at RBK 000-32444/2. And if we look at the second paragraph under A5, which is entitled Live Issues Report by the Director of Housing, it says this: in response to Councillor Bakhtir, Ms Johnson advised that TMO tenant doors were checked for fire safety compliance as part of an annual programme and replaced if non-compliant. She agreed to provide an update to the committee on the exact number of non-compliant TMO tenant doors. Now, you weren't at this meeting, but would you have read the minutes?
Yes, I would.
And it appears from this that Councillor Bakhtir had picked up on the point about non-compliant doors. Do you see that?
I do.
And that Laura Johnson agreed to provide an update. Now, would it be fair to say that it was this is another instance to which you refer of concern by the committee about the rate of progress on this issue?
Yes, we'd always been told that the tenants' doors were compliant. I recognise the question here was challenging that again, rightly. So our focus historically had been on the leaseholder doors, which we were told were the ones which weren't compliant.
Now, you referred earlier on in evidence to the Adair Tower fire, and if I could now take you to that and ask you some questions on it. Just to fix you in time, on the 12th of October 2015, the LFB issued a deficiency notice to the TMO in respect of Adair Tower. And if I show it to you so you know what I'm talking about, is at TMO 00842271. And there you go. The title, Identification of the Premises. Thank you. And if we could zoom out and just go to page 3. And page 3 sets out, and thereafter, various deficiencies which the LFB had identified. Mr. Marshall, my first question is, did you ever see this notice?
No, I was never shown this notice.
Were you made aware of it, and if so, when?
I don't think we were made aware of it specifically, but we were made aware as part of a commentary that a notice had been issued. I believe that was in January 2016, but it might have been in November 2015. I can't remember precisely.
Did the commentary give you the substance of the deficiencies that had been identified by the LFB, or was it simply confined to the fact that a notice had been served?
I'm afraid I can't remember. It did say that a notice had been served, and I think it gave some pretty high-level introduction. Otherwise, it would have been a peculiar sentence just to say a notice has been served, full stop, with no commentary. Looking
at Article 11 that's on the page now, would you have been given that level of detail? And looking at the middle column, area of concern, would you have been given that level of detail in the commentary?
No, I don't think so.
So would it be fair to summarise your evidence this way, that you were given no particular cause for concern about the subject matter of the notice? I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that a fair summary?
It wouldn't be that we wouldn't have cause for concern. Of course, any such finding is a cause for concern. I think it was more that we thought that it was being addressed. So we were given comfort that the issues have been taken seriously and were being addressed.
Now, there was a fire at Adair Tower on Saturday, the 31st of October, so I think 19 days or so after the notice of deficiency had been served. And that fire was considered at your meeting, the HPSC meeting, on the 5th of November 2015. If we could go to the minutes, which are RBK 000 47688 /6. I'll simply invite you to skim read A7 rather than read it out. There's no mention in that summary there to the notice of deficiency. Can you recall whether Mr. Black raised it at all during the course of this meeting? I appreciate this is now 6 years ago or so.
I can't. Reading that, it would appear he didn't make explicit. And I have to say, even in the questions you've been asking me now, I think I was confused in my own mind about the deficiency notice, which you showed before, and this conversation around the fire. So thinking about that, I'm not sure we were made aware of the deficiency notice occurring before a fire. So we were aware of the fire brigade making recommendations after the fire.
Now, and just following that through, bearing in mind the nature of your role as the scrutiny committee, would you have expected Mr. Black to have informed you of the fact and the substance of the deficiency notice that had been served on the 12th of October at this meeting on the 5th of November?
Yes, listening to it now, it's material.
Now, could I ask you to turn back to paragraph 49 of your first statement, which is at RBK 000 33744 /12. Now, you mention here the mid-year review on the TMO performance, a report prepared by Laura Johnson, and you quote paragraph 8.1 of that report, which touched on health and safety and fire safety in particular. Now, what it might be quite useful to do is look at that paragraph. Now, there appears to be no mention of the Adair Tower fire. Would you like to go over the page just to sort of see the complete picture? Is it surprising that there was no mention of Adair Tower, given the proximity of the fire to this meeting on the 5th of November?
No, because the papers were normally prepared about 10 days before and sent out to us. Well, they would have been prepared by 10 days before and then sent out to us. So I don't know whether these were prepared before the fire, but I would expect so given the dates.
And where there was a relevant event in the intervening period between circulation of papers and the meeting, would updates be provided in writing or orally at the meeting itself?
Orally.
Now, Laura Johnson prepared a report for your committee on the 6th of January 2016, and if we could go to RBK 000-32439. There you go, just so you can see the start of that. And if we can go to page 5 and look at paragraph 4.6 at the very bottom of the page. And it says this, the TMO, and I quote, has been advised by the London Fire Brigade that the Council TMO will be served with 2 enforcement notices as a result of the fire risk assessments the Brigade undertook following the fire at Adair Tower. 1 enforcement notice will cover Adair Tower and 1 will cover Hazelwood Tower. The 2 towers were built to the same design, having 2 separate staircases, 1 for accommodation access, the main staircase, and 1 for emergency, the escape staircase. 4.7, the TMO has yet to receive the actual notices, but has been advised that the key matters of concern relate to the design of the main staircase, ventilation system, and the lack of self-closers on the individual flat front doors. It should be noticed that the TMO has agreed with the Council to fit self-closers to all flat front doors within both Adair and Hazelwood Towers, and the fitting programme has now commenced. It is expected that the notices should be received in the next week or so. Having read that, were you concerned about the prospect of service of enforcement notices, which could ultimately lead to prosecution if not complied with?
Clearly, would be concerned about enforcement notices, meaning there were deficiencies. But I recall being satisfied on questioning that the GMO were then taking the necessary action to comply with the notices.
Now, if we go back to your first witness statement, RBK 000-33744/14 and paragraph 50, you say there, you note that Robert Black had addressed the HPSC meeting and referred to the fire at Adair Tower. Now, looking at what's set out there, Mr. Black made it clear that the LFB's concerns weren't limited to Adair and Hazelwood Towers, but extended across the estate. Would you agree with that as a summary of what's set out there?
Yes.
Presumably that was a matter of concern to you and your committee.
Absolutely. As I said, though, in discussion with them or asking them questions, they told us that this had happened, and they told us that they were going to take it seriously and address the points.
During the course of those discussions, was any consideration given to asking the TMO to set out in writing for you the substance of its responses to the LFB?
No, I don't think we asked for a written report.
Or its proposals as to compliance with the notices?
No, we would expect that they would then continue to report to us. The pattern would be more that they would tell us these things, we'd ask about it, and then we would expect to be updated periodically subsequently.
Now, one issue which arose out of Adair Tower was the information provided to tenants. And in that regard, can we look at TMO 100-11798? Excuse me. And if we could go to the very end of this chain, and it's an email from Councillor Mason to you. Councillor Mason is Pat, is that right?
Correct.
Now, Councillor Mason says this, under the heading Adair Tower Fire. At the last CCSE meeting, can you help us? CCSE, what does that stand for?
Corporate and Cabinet Services Committee.
Thank you. I was asked to request if you could tell us what advice the TMO gives to its tenants in the case of a fire. The question came up because the Borough Fire Commander told the committee, the last time he visited, that although Adair Tower flats were fitted with smoke-proof doors, people opened them during the fire, letting in the smoke, when they may have been safer staying indoors and then started walking down 13 stories of smoke-filled stairs. Perhaps it's not possible to stop people leaving a building in panic during a fire. Now, on receipt of that email, were you concerned about the quality and substance of the advice given to TMO residents in the event of a fire?
I can't remember exactly what I was thinking in response to this email. I do know that we have been told about the stay put policy, and it had been explained to us, and we felt or understood it to be a sensible policy.
Was that the thrust of the advice you'd received?
Yes, well, I wouldn't say advice, that was what we've been told, yes.
Now, if we scroll further up this email chain, you copy in Robert Black for a response. It's just the next page. You say, it's very bottom of the page, you say, Mr. Black, could you let us know what is normally advised, especially in towers? Also, could you give some thought to Councillor Mason's questions about weekends? And if we go further up, there we go, we've got Mr. Black's response. Now, would you agree that at this stage you would have been aware of the issue regarding door closers because of what had been discussed in relation to door closer issues previously?
Yes, I believe so. This is January 2016.
And again, would it be fair to say that your evidence is this, that you relied upon the assurances given to you by officers and the TMO and were satisfied that action was being taken?
Yes.
Now, if we can go to the RBKC Cabinet Corporate Services Scrutiny Committee and the minutes of the 8th of February 2016, and if those minutes can be found at RBK 000-58101, and if we go to page 3, and the second paragraph from the very top of the page, which starts with the words Councillor Campbell. And it says this, and I quote, Councillor Campbell drew attention to the statement on page 1 that fire safety information is provided to residents on the TMO website. She considered this inadequate, as not all residents would have access to the website. Referring to page 2, she drew attention to the comment that some dwellings were provided with LFB leaflets and asked which ones were not. The chairman undertook to take this up with the TMO. Now, would you agree that by this stage, so February 2016, there's a pattern of concern from councillors about the provision or lack of provision of information to residents?
Yes, I think Councillor Campbell is certainly expressing that concern here.
And Councillor Mason had done previously?
Yes.
Now, if we go to back to your first witness statement, I'm afraid, Mr. Marshall, paragraph 51, which is at RBK 000-33744/14. And you say this, and I quote, I do not know which individual had specific responsibility for fire safety at the TMO, including at Grenfell Tower. The information I had from sitting on the HPSC was from the reports listed above. Based on what we were told, there were no, quotes, red flags, close quotes, in relation to fire safety, including at Grenfell Tower. Given the enforcement notices that had been served by LFIPA, wouldn't it been incumbent upon you to find out who did have specific responsibility for fire safety at the TMO?
I don't think so, because we would always interact with the chief officer or the chief executive in relation to the TMO. So we would see those people as being responsible, and in turn they would follow that chain of accountability through their organisations.
And would it flow from the answer you gave earlier on that notwithstanding the service of the enforcement notices, you had no reason to seek the advice of RBKC's in-house health and safety advisor or their own fire risk assessors?
No, we wouldn't as a scrutiny committee.
Okay. Now, in the second sentence of that paragraph, you said that there were, quotes, no red flags, close quotes, in relation to fire safety, including at Grenfell. Would you agree with the suggestion that the service of enforcement notices in relation to Adair Tower and the concerns regarding information given to tenants in the event of a fire did constitute red flags?
Yes, I would. I don't think that was a very well phrased sentence. I think when I wrote it, I was referring to the formal documents we received from the TMO on a twice annual basis.
Irrespective of format of documents that were provided to you, can you remember whether at the time the issue of the enforcement notices and information given to tenants was treated as a red flag issue by your committee, or indeed the officers who reported to your committee?
I can't easily speak to the latter, but certainly we took any matters like this very seriously.
Now, I think I'm right in saying that the HPSC meeting on the 11th of May 2016 was your last as chairman, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, if we can go to the minutes of that meeting, which are RBK 000144436. Now, you can take it from me, and I'm sure if this is wrong, I will be corrected, but there's no mention in these minutes of the enforcement notices or LFB's concerns regarding self-closures across the TMO housing stock. Does that absence demonstrate that those issues were unimportant to the HPSC?
No, it would have meant that they weren't raised at this meeting.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to a separate and distinct topic, which is the Grenfell Tower refurbishment review? And can we now look at the issue of the petition regarding the works at Grenfell that was brought before your committee in late 2015 and then later into 2016? Now, you deal with this petition in your first witness statement at paragraphs 107 through to 120. And the references can be found at RBK 000337444/26. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go through all of that again. I've given the reference. But can you remember when you were first made aware of the fact of the petition?
Not precisely. I would imagine in advance of the council meeting, I think from memory, maybe a week before.
Who made you aware of it?
I believe either Councillor Fielding Mellon or Miss Johnson, but I'm not certain.
Now, can we go to the petition itself, which is RBK quintuple 0 and specifically the prayer of that petition? And it says, basically, we, the undersigned, residents of Grenfell Tower, ask the chairman of the Housing, Property and Scrutiny Committee to undertake an urgent scrutiny of the TMO and Ryden's management of the refurbishment project. It says, time and again, residents' views have been ignored or downplayed. Despite interventions from our MP, our day-to-day concerns are belittled and sidelined. And then further substance set out, and then the signatures. Now, taking the step back, would you agree that the strong language of that prayer, at the very least, evidenced the strength of residents' views?
Yes.
And it would appear, given the number of signatories, that a significant number of residents supported the petition. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
It asked that lessons be learned from the project. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And that Grenfell residents' views and experience be canvassed and included in the report so that future projects could benefit. Do you agree with that as well?
Yes.
Did you accept that request at the time as being reasonable or not?
Yes. Yes. That we should undertake scrutiny of the programme. Yes.
And going beyond that, learning lessons?
Yes.
And that Grenfell residents' views should be canvassed so that future projects could be informed by the Grenfell experience?
Yes, but as I referred to earlier, I don't think at that time we routinely, as a committee, engaged directly with residents. So I don't think we would have expected to have played a direct role in that canvassing process. We did, as it happened, Mr. Defan came to our committee and spoke, but it wouldn't be normal for us to go and undertake a canvassing exercise ourselves.
Can we look at an email chain now that begins on the 7th of December 2015? And it starts with an email from Laura Johnson to you and Councillor Fielding Mellon. And the first email in the chain is at RBK *0 3567. And it starts at the bottom of this page. You see there, Councillor FM and Councillor Marshall, and it goes over the page and sets out a petition being handed in. Second paragraph invites whether you want to discuss matters with Mr. Black or Mr. Madison. And it concludes, I would like your guidance on how you wish to respond to the petition. She then includes the prayer that we've just looked at. And then if we could look at the response from Rock Fielding Mellon, so going back to page 1. He says this, and I quote, as the petition is addressed to the chair of HPSC, I must defer to Councillor Marshall. However, I would agree with you that both the Housing Department and the TMO must be mindful of their limited manpower and resources, must make sure that they spread such limited resources as evenly and fairly across the council's entire HRA estate, rather than focusing predominantly wherever the loudest complaints are coming from. The council has acknowledged the disruption and inconvenience caused by such major refurbishment and improvement works being done to Grenfell Tower, but I believe that it is the inevitable price that must be paid by the residents in order to have their flats brought up to very good modern standards. I trust that both the TMO and Ryden will continue to work with residents of GT on a case-by-case basis, helping to fix individual problems that have resulted from the refurbishment, as the council committed to in the amended motion last week. Now, looking at that email correspondence in the round, would it be fair or reasonable to say that neither Laura Johnson nor Councillor Fielding Mellon were in favour of a review?
I think they were saying that they didn't have the resources within the department to undertake a review by the officers, a full, complete review, yes.
And they were basically saying it was over to you, is the thrust of Councillor Fielding Mellon's email.
He was saying it was for me to decide, well, I say me, the committee, to decide how to respond to the petition. It had been referred to us by the full council.
And if we go to your response at the top of this page, you see there, 8th of December 2015 at 16:15, you said this, and I quote, "My instinct was to add an oral agenda item to our next meeting rather than a report. What do you both think? I'm sure a majority of members could be pre-briefed to understand how to play it." Why did you ask Miss Johnson and Councillor Fielding Mellon for their views?
Because I was making a suggestion and I wanted them to tell me if they agreed with it.
You didn't think it was matter solely for you, given you were the chairman?
I could have insisted on one thing or another, but it's not unreasonable to ask their views.
Now, looking at your statement, and I quote, "I'm sure a majority of members could be pre-briefed to understand how to play it," close quotes. Are you suggesting there that you pre-brief the members of the committee?
Yes, in relation to whether there should be an oral report or a written report.
Was that a majority of committee members or the members of the committee who were from the majority party?
No, I think just a majority of members.
What do you mean by the phrase, quotes, "understand how to play it," close quotes?
Well, that we wouldn't have a written report, that we would deal with this orally.
Was your intention to instruct the majority of how to play it?
No, couldn't. My colleagues would not take my instruction even if I sought to give it. That wasn't the nature of our relationship. They were an entirely independent group of 10 other councillors.
So you made no effort to predetermine the decision?
No, I could bring my own views, but I could tell them why I thought that it was reasonable, particularly over Christmas. And given that what I've been told by both the senior officer and the cabinet member, that if we'd asked for a report, it would be difficult for them.
Can you remember now the gist of the words or the gist of the discussions you had when briefing the majority of the members?
To be honest, I don't actually recall doing so.
When you were discussing how best to, quotes, play it, close quotes, did you have regard to the 4 principles of scrutiny that we considered at the start of your examination, or at least the substance of them?
Yes, so I considered that an oral report would allow us to conduct proper scrutiny. I wouldn't have agreed to do something which would have led to an improper level of scrutiny. It was just whether that would require a full written report at this stage.
This email exchange wasn't set out in your witness statement. Can you help us as to why it wasn't mentioned in your statement? Or any of your statements, I should say.
I don't think it was material.
Could we turn to another email chain from the 19th of December 2015, which can be found at RBK 000 30741. Now, if we can expand the top email, which is one to Councillor Blakeman, you say this: I would be willing to hear from the residents, although, to be clear, they will not be permitted to question officers. That's quite a clear steer from you to another councillor, isn't it, of how you wanted to play the meeting?
Yes, one of the few distinguishing features of my role versus our councillors was maintaining order at a meeting. So on that sense, absolutely, that was my role.
Looking back now, prompted by this email chain, do you think it's likely that you would have briefed the majority of members of your committee by this stage, so the 19th of December?
No, I don't think I did brief the majority of the members of the committee. As a guess, and it is a guess, I might have spoken to my vice chairman. You can ask him later. I know he's coming, but I can't remember doing so. To be honest, I don't think I felt I probably needed to.
Was it his view, Mr. Mackover's view, that a speech and no questions would not be allowed?
As I've said, I can't remember speaking to him. I'm just surmising what, if I were to have spoken to someone, the most likely person that I would have spoken to would have been him.
Could we now go to another email chain, which is RBK 000 46301? And it's the first email in that chain, which starts at the bottom of the first page. Now, Peter Madison, on 24th of December 2015, circulated a briefing note on the refurbishment of the tower. Do you recall receiving and reading that note?
I'm not certain. I've definitely read it, but I can't recall precisely when I've read it. But I would presume I would have read it between Christmas and the meeting.
Can we move up this chain to an email from Robert Black on the 4th of January 2016? There we go. It says this, and I quote: I've just picked up this briefing, was sent to you before Christmas. My apologies, but it should have been marked confidential. As it is going to my board tonight as a confidential paper, I wonder if you could treat this as confidential until after my board meeting. If it help, spelling is correct, it can be tabled at the scrutiny committee, close quotes. Was it of any undue concern that Mr. Black wanted to keep the paper confidential?
I don't recall. I can't remember whether I thought it was of concern or not. In general, our view throughout this process was that the TMO was keeping things confidential, which we couldn't see why they needed to be. They would assert that these documents were confidential to them and that it wasn't for us. We didn't have the right to disclose things.
How did you press them on whether the plea of confidentiality was well made?
In our committee meetings.
And how did they respond to that pressure from you?
They asserted that they were confidential to them.
Did they give you any greater detail as to why they were confidential? For example, did they say it included commercially sensitive material or anything of that nature?
I can't remember the exact arguments used. I think in the 6th of January meeting potentially, and I think also maybe in the May 2016 meeting, We had council legal officers sitting with us, and I can't remember again if they spoke directly to this, but certainly their presence and their lack of challenge to it, if that's what happened, and I can't remember precisely, we would have taken as a sign of that our own lawyers were implicitly validating this approach.
So because of that, you were content not to press the matter further. Is that a fair summary?
No, not content not to. No, we thought that certainly the board report, which came to us in May 2016, should be made public. So, going to your earlier questions in terms of our powers, this is quite a good example in the sense of we couldn't compel them to do anything. All we could keep saying is, why? We will keep asking that question.
Now, can we
Sorry, can I just interrupt for a moment? I mean, the impression I get from this email is that at that stage, the paper in question hadn't gone to the TMO board. And what Mr. Black is saying is that you should treat it as confidential until after the board meeting. It can be tabled at the scrutiny committee. Did that give you to understand what was going on?
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I think that's correct. So if I've read it properly, he's saying it's confidential for the next 24 hours because I believe their meeting occurred on the 5th and our meeting would have occurred on the 6th. If he's agreeing that it would be tabled on the 6th, by definition it's a public meeting and would have then been made public.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Do you recall whether it was tabled at the scrutiny committee?
I'm afraid I don't.
It may appear from the minutes, but I just wondered if you could recall.
I can't remember. Of course, by this stage I would have read it, so I'm not sure I would have remembered whether it was subsequently tabled.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
just flowing from that, sir, just so we get your evidence clear, did you have further instances of frustration that the TMO said that papers were confidential and you were pressing for their publication?
No, as you mentioned, I left the committee in May 2016, so the only other, and I'd say the most significant, perhaps the only occasion where I had that was in relation to this board report, which was clearly a very important document.
Now, can we go to an email chain which begins on the 5th of January 2016 between Robert Black and Laura Johnson, and that can be found at TMO 00852 704. And if we go to page 4 in this chain, and it's the first email from Robert Black, which ought to be 5th of January 2016, sent at 15:23. And if we go to the third paragraph down, it says this: in terms of outcomes, the board agreed we needed to finish the project, carry out a review to see what has worked and not, i.e. lessons learned. Usually this would be officers doing it, but they want it to be involved, which is fine and adds the challenge and independence. Paula Fantz wants to be involved and adds value to her regeneration work. She was very supportive. Cush will get involved and a few others, as could Judith. They can listen to the issues. The board feels this is a TMO matter and wants to deal with it itself. I imagine they will be happy to share the outcomes with scrutiny. And if we can go to page 3 of this email chain, at the very bottom of that page, and an email sent by Laura Johnson at 16:36, and the second paragraph says this: board recommendations seem very reasonable. RBKC has no desire to be involved in the review. I shall echo this point. Councillor Mackover, so that recommendations the board has made are supported at scrutiny committee. And if we go further up the page to see Robert Black's response at the top of page 3, he says there, last push for tonight. Will let Councillor Marshall know my board decision. Might be worth reminding him they have 4 appointees and Pauline has confirmed she is happy to be on the review. And if we go over the page to page 2, Laura Johnson's response there, 6th of January 2016, 11:38. She says this, and I quote: I've emailed Councillor Marshall the board outcome, so he's aware, and in that email I remind him that Paula was an RBKC nominee. We can make this point again tonight if a scrutiny committee member is suggested as being on the review of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. Now, if we can, having set out that long run-up, can we now look at an email to Councillor Mackover copying you from Laura Johnson, and that can be found at RBK 0030744. we can see you're copied in. It's dated the 5th of January, sent at 4:46, and it says this: the TMO board met on Monday night. One of the items on the agenda was Grenfell Tower and the impending discussion at Scrutiny Committee on the 6th of January. The board agreed, and she set out what has previously been quoted, and concludes with this: I'm sure Mr. Black will raise this as on Wednesday, but if not, I thought I would share it with you, as it would be useful if a suggested outcome of the discussion at Scrutiny Committee could support the TMO and the due process they are undertaking. Now, looking at that email in the round, why would it have been sent to Councillor Mackover and not you, who's still then the chair?
Honestly, I don't know. I believe he might have gone to the Tenants Consultative Committee, which I believe, solely from the papers I've read subsequently, I think was happening the same week. So potentially maybe they had had a conversation at that, or you'd have to ask him, I'm afraid. But I agree.
It just seems odd at first blush.
I agree. And I haven't seen those other emails. And I think one thing we were always jealous of, and I'm afraid this was the source of some friction over very many years, was our prerogatives. It was for us to decide as a committee how we wished to proceed. Of course, we took great account of our officers' advice. We respected them. I think Ms Johnson was a very fine officer, but it wouldn't be for her to tell us how we wish to proceed.
That really comes to the question I was going to ask you next, whether you treated the last paragraph of that email as a weighted piece of advice, if not an instruction.
I think if I thought it was an instruction, if anything, it would have prompted me to do the precise opposite. Say we were quite jealous of those prerogatives. We had few of them, but the ability to decide our own agenda and how we wished to proceed was one of the few.
Did you consider that last paragraph to be within the bounds of propriety?
I can't remember. Reading it now, I think it's very close to wherever those bounds lie.
But you wouldn't have acquiesced in it. Seems to be the thrust of your evidence.
No, and indeed, even if I had, or indeed Councillor Mackover had, we were 2 of 11 people, and the other 9 people would have similarly, they would have expressed their own views. So we had no. That's perhaps the reason that these scrutiny was performed by a committee, not by single individuals. Sorry, if I just to say, it also included, of course, members of the minority party. So it wasn't just a consensus amongst one political grouping. It was designed to encourage independent thought.
Just going back to the addressee point, it's possible that the email wasn't addressed to you directly because you already knew the substance. Are you able to help us whether that's a fair, reasonable inference to draw from the fact it was primarily addressed to Councillor Mackover?
I don't know, because I don't recall having any emails or conversations with Ms Johnson around what their board had discussed in the 24 hours before the committee. It would be very unlikely that I would.
Mr. Cornelia, can we just be clear about that? Is the suggestion that Councillor Marshall might already have had a conversation with Ms Johnson, at which he had given him the thought that's in that last paragraph?
Yes.
Well, I think that ought to be put a bit more clearly.
Again, I can't remember precisely, so I don't want to mislead you, but it's extremely unlikely I would have had a conversation with Ms Johnson. Most of our interactions, other than when we had an agenda planning meeting, were through email, so it would have been a matter of record.
Yeah, but you understand what Mr. Kinnear is putting to you. He's suggesting that this email didn't need...
Because I'd already been...
You'd already been got at.
And I'm saying I think that's extremely unlikely.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Could we look at the minutes of the Scrutiny Committee meeting? And there are RBK 000-32130. And Grenfell is addressed as item A4 on page 2. I'm not going to take you through all of it, but if we could look at page 4 in the second paragraph. Councillor Mackover thanked residents for attending. You'll see slightly further down on the fifth line, it's recorded as saying Councillor Mackover suggested that a working group could have a look at the lessons learned for future regeneration projects, and he would be happy to chair this group. Next paragraph, Councillor Beryl Cox agreed that a working group would be the best mechanism to conduct a review and look at the lessons learned. He said that it was important to look at what consultation proposals were in place for any future projects. Let me go further down the page, if we may. At the bottom, Councillor Press said that Grenfell Tower is the first example of regeneration of a tower in the borough, and as good practice there should be a review of how the project went, and she would support a recommendation for a working group. And she said that Councillor Blakeman's comments that the group need to be independent with the resource and skills necessary. She said an independent reviewer may be useful to give expertise. Now, there seemed to be at least a body of opinion that a working group was a good idea. Is that a fair summary of the reality of the meeting?
Yes, which is why that was what we agreed to do.
Yeah. And just following on from that, we see at the paragraph at the top of the page, which starts with the chairman said that if a working group was established, then it would decide on what resources it needed and its scope. He said, however, that he was reluctant to establish another working group until those in existence had reported. He suggested the group was not set up immediately, that urgent complaints should be dealt with through the TMO process. And then if we go to the conclusions section, which is further down that page, I think. There we go. In conclusion, the chairman agreed that a working group would be commissioned at some point in the future, but this was dependent on a number of factors, including the conclusion of existing working groups and the review work conducted by the TMO. Was it fair to say that the reluctance to set up a working group came from you and you alone, or were there others who shared your view?
I was certainly reluctant to set up a working group for several reasons. I can't remember if other people voiced those concerns. I think my concerns were perhaps unique to me because of being in the position I was. Namely, we tended to be rather better at setting up working groups than actually concluding them. And my thought was we needed to conclude things we're already doing before setting up more groups. And secondly, having just been informed that there was a report being produced on exactly the same subject by an independent group of people, namely the TMO board, that I wasn't quite sure what we could do. Added to which, the scope of a working group, as I mentioned earlier, was that it was constituted of a small number of councillors, 3 or 5 of them, interrogating officers, and I presume in this case it would have also included TMO employees, although I can't remember another working group where they were involved, and essentially replicated what we were doing in full committee. So in this case, we'd spent quite a considerable amount of time at that meeting in full committee, challenging the TMO and our officers on the points raised by residents. So I wasn't quite sure where a working group with exactly the same set of people would go, other than reaching exactly the same set of conclusions that we'd already reached, talking about it for, I think it was an hour and a half in full committee.
Can you help us? What was independent about the proposed TMO review?
So it was constituted, as I understand it, of members of their board, all of whom were non-executives, some of whom were resident members, some of whom were appointed by the borough, some of whom were, as I understand it, had a reasonable level of expertise in the field of housing, so all of whom were not part of the TMO executive.
Can you remember now when Councillor Press referred to the need for the group to be independent with the resources and skills necessary, did she express any concerns that a TMO review did not satisfy that threshold of independence?
No, I don't believe anyone expressed that view. I believe, and if they had, it would have almost certainly made it into the minutes, because they would have disagreed with us waiting for the TMO's review to be conducted.
Do you recall any pushback from either Councillor Blakeman or Councillor Press or Councillor Beryl Cox or indeed Councillor Mackover about the independence of the TMO review?
No.
Could we now look at another email chain, and that's between you and Victoria Borwick MP, and that was in March 2016. Can be found at Met 78084. I won't take you through the entire chain. We only need to look at the first of the email on this first page, dated the 3rd of March 2016. You sign it Q. Did you know, Ms. Borwick?
Very well.
And if we look at your summary of your initial conclusions, you say at 1, we're spending about 100k per flat of public money to improve the building. While there's been some disruption, there's a massive level of support, and to some extent, I think, when seen in the round, worth a bit of disruption. For leaseholders in particular, this is essentially £100,000 gift from the state. I'm therefore not massively sympathetic to general, quotes, it's all terrible, close quotes, complaints. Looking at 2, when pressed, very few specific complaints have been made and evidenced. Where there have been complaints, these are being treated seriously by the TMO. 3, there's been a very unpleasant campaign against the TMO and certain officers. This does not reflect well on those involved. 4, having inspected the flats, my judgment is some of the wilder claims are grossly exaggerated. You go further down, next paragraph. When you met people, did they actually cite specifics? Mr. Defan at committee made wild and unsubstantiated claims which were not credible. I'm certain the works weren't absolutely perfect, and there'll be things to learn and improve on, hence the review. But equally, we need to take some of what has been said with a large pinch of salt. Now, at this stage, is it fair to say that you'd read the petition?
Yes.
And presumably you'd read Mr. Madison's briefing note that he'd circulated on Christmas Eve
I would presume
2015.
so. And had the debate at the committee on the 6th of January.
And you'd agreed, at least in principle, to commission a working group, but whose work was to start at an indeterminate time in the future.
Yes, when the board review had completed.
And you'd visited the tower, I think, on the 13th of January 2016, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
But is it fair to say that at this stage you hadn't investigated the substance of the residents' concerns and complaints?
Well, we had, because we talked about them specifically in our meeting on the 6th of January. One of our challenges, and this is what I refer to here, is that there were very few specifics mentioned. So, for example, it was cited that there had been a campaign of, I believe, harassment, lies and intimidation conducted by the TMO, but without any detail to substantiate that. And those claims did not seem credible to me. What I wrote here was exactly what I was thinking at the time.
Would you accept, though, in your role as chairman of the scrutiny committee, you had to keep an open mind on these matters?
Yes, which is why I think I said my initial conclusion.
Was the emphasis on the word initial or the emphasis on the word conclusion?
I don't think you can separate the two. I think this is an initial conclusion.
Well, looking at the substance of what you've set out at points 1 through to 4, you're not sympathetic to its all terrible complaints. You say there's very few specific complaints made and evidenced. You say some of the wilder claims are grossly exaggerated. You said Mr. Defan made wild, unsubstantiated claims which were not credible. And you recommended taking a large pinch of salt when considering those matters. To the lay eye, they may tend to suggest that you'd formed a view, a relatively firm view, at this stage. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but if I may, you omitted the sentence which says, I think that the works weren't absolutely perfect and that there will be things to learn and improve on, which was, I think, where we were at this stage. This was, the complaints were not about specific things which were immediate at that time. They were about lessons to be learned for future similar redevelopment.
Could we now turn to some email correspondence you had with Mr. David Collins, just in relation to the working group, just following through some of the evidence you've just given. Now, these emails are at RBK 000-28465. And if we go to the bottom of page 2 of this chain, which hopefully is an email from Mr. Collins to you on the 24th of April. There we go, at the very bottom, sent at 10:17. And Mr. Collins said he was writing to you on behalf of the Grenfell Tower Residents Association. Please, could we meet with you to discuss the setting up of the RBKC working group, which is going to investigate the TMO's handling of the Grenfell Tower improvement works and the impact that had on well-being of residents. We are seeking assurances that the working group will be independent of our BKC and TMO, and we're also asking that residents be allowed to contribute to the questions asked by the working group. Now, your response, if we go back, oh, sorry, it's at the top of the page there, sorry, is sent on the 28th of April 2016, and you say this, and I quote, at its AGM in May, the Council will appoint a new Housing and Property Scrutiny Committee. I would imagine many of the members will be the same as this year. However, I will be standing down and will no longer be on the committee. At our May meeting, which precedes the AGM, we will receive the TMO report on Grenfell Tower. It will then be for the new committee to decide how it wishes to pursue the matter further, including whether it wishes to set up a working group. I would note, however, that while a working group would consist of councillors, not officers, it would not be independent of our BKC. Might I therefore suggest you approach the new chairman of the committee when he/her is appointed to discuss how the committee will proceed. Essentially, you're saying it was no longer a matter for you. Is that a fair summary?
I was saying I couldn't take any or couldn't give him any assurances or tell him anything about a committee on which I would no longer be sitting.
And Mr. Marshall.
No, just to say, I think reading it here, my answer was a rather technical answer, which is to say, he was asking me to bind my successors, and I was saying I can't do that because I'm not going to be part of that group to take that decision.
Now, if we look at Mr. Collins's response, which is just further up the page, or indeed over the page, I think. There we go. He says in the second paragraph of his response, dated the 1st of May, this, and I quote, however, it's not acceptable to suggest the group will not be taking forward its commitment to investigate the handling of Grenfell Tower improvement works by the TMO. I was in the public gallery for the Scrutiny Committee on the 6th of January 2016, when, after committee discussion, you committed the committee to investigate the matter during 2016. His concern there seems to be that the TMO would be unable to undertake a critical examination of its own actions, looking at what is set out in the third paragraph of that email. Would you agree with that?
In the third, did you say?
Yes, in the third paragraph.
I'm not sure I'm quite getting on the third paragraph the point about that he wasn't satisfied with the independence of the board. Maybe you could.
Well, if you de-expand and if you go down, sorry, if you can expand this email, and if you read on, the absence of follow through here leaves me only to think that some are too scared to explore alternative narratives. And then we go on. Dissatisfaction with the manner in which the TMO have managed and carried out the works.
Yes, sorry.
And then go on and then concludes, these people's views and experiences going to be dismissed or ignored because they do not fit with the official narrative from the TMO. And so maybe I should have put it better, Mr. Marshall, I apologise, but looking at the email in the round, would you agree that Mr. Collins's underlying concern is that the TMO would not be able to undertake a critical examination of its own actions?
Yes, although I think I would have thought there's a distinction between the TMO executive and the TMO board. If the TMO board couldn't critique and hold its own executive to account, I'm not quite sure what function it played.
Now, can you remember whether you responded to this email chain?
I don't think I did, because I don't think I felt there was anything more I could say beyond what I'd already said.
Now, you did have a further exchange with Councillor Mackover, and it might be best, sir, bearing in mind the time that I come to that after a brief break.
Yes, all right. Well, that sounds sensible. Well, Mr. Marshall, we're going to have a short break now. We'll resume, if we may, please, at 25 to 4. And again, I have to ask you not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? Okay. Thank you very much. .25 to 4 then, please.
Thanks, sir.
Yep. Yes, would you ask Mr. Marshall to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Marshall, all ready to keep going?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Marshall, we were just considering your email exchange with Mr. Collins, and I was about to take you to a further exchange you had with Councillor Mackover. Now, that can be found at RBK 000060054. And it's the first email there, 3rd of May 2016, from Sam Mackover. And he says, to my recollection, if we can go further down, please. To my recollection, the position HPS took, having visited the site, was to review the findings of the board's report when it was complete. This will be done 11th of May. Then it is up to HPS members to vote on whether there are any further lessons learnt to review. Now, you reply further up. Indeed. And it is for the next committee to decide what it wishes to do. If I were on it, I'd probably conclude we'd spent enough time on the subject already. I certainly wouldn't want a working group. At best, I would spend half an hour in full committee reviewing it. Bottom line, we spent over £100,000 per flat. The end result looks great as far as I can see. The people we saw were happy, the flats look great, and to date I've seen no specific allegations or complaints, only generalisations and hyperbole. Now, your response there indicates that you were emphatically against a working group. Is that a fair characterisation of your view at the time?
I wasn't in favour of a working group, yes.
Yeah. And for the same reasons you gave earlier on in your evidence?
Yes.
Now, you said you'd seen no specific allegations. Wasn't that why, or wasn't that a good reason to set up the working group, to look into allegations and complaints and determine whether they were meritorious or not?
We were constitutionally barred from looking at specific complaints, meaning person A complaining about issue B. But when I'm saying no specific allegations or complaints, there were no specifics that we were given. So everything was phrased in terms of we have been the subjects of harassment, we haven't been listened to. But this was completely contradicted by what we were hearing from the TMO and validated by our own officers.
Wouldn't the working group, though, provided the mechanism to identify the specifics, to drill down into the detail, and that you denied yourself the opportunity of so doing?
Well, my presumption was that we were, at this point, still waiting for the board review, and that the board review would have done all this. So I didn't see much additional utility in us going and asking the same questions.
But you weren't willing here in your email to say, let's wait for the TMO board review and then decide whether a working group would be a useful exercise.
No, I was commenting on where I saw it at the time, the 3rd of May.
Mr. Marshall, those are all the questions I have for you now. Chairman, there were some problems with relativity earlier on in the day.
Oh, right.
We think they have been resolved, but might I ask that you rise to allow me 20 minutes to see if there are any further matters which arise, which may accommodate any further relativity problems if they haven't been resolved?
Yes, all right. Well, Mr. Marshall, when Council gets to the end of his questions, or thinks he's got to the end of his questions, we always have a break to give him a chance to review the position and also to take into consideration questions that may be suggested by others who are following this but not in the room. So having got you back in for 5 minutes, I'm now going to invite you to go out again. And if we've had problems with the technology, I think it's sensible to have a slightly longer break than we would otherwise normally do. So I'm going to say 4 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock we'll see if there are any more questions for you. All right?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. So please go with the usher. Thank you. All right, Mr. Kinnear, 4 o'clock.
Thanks, sir.
I hope there won't be any difficulties at that point. If there are, you'll no doubt let us know.
Will do. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much. Would you ask Mr. Marshall to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Marshall, we'll see if there are any more questions we need to ask you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Marshall, earlier on we were discussing the email in which you characterised Mr. Defan's complaints as wild and unsubstantiated, to quote. Why did you not ask him to provide examples or question him about those claims at the HPSC meeting on the 6th of January 2016?
The end of his presentation was difficult because he wanted to continue speaking for significantly longer than we had allowed for him. So it wasn't easy at that point, I think, to start a question and answer session. And to be fair to him, he wasn't there to be asked questions of us. It was the other way around.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Marshall, before we end today, is there anything you would like to say to the panel that we haven't covered in examination but you'd wish them to have regard to?
I think I'd like to emphasise 2 points you've raised in questioning. One is, I think it's clear we should have had fire safety as a standing item on our agenda. I think we dealt with it as it arose, but particularly seeing the documents you've showed me today, it's evident that should have been something that was a standing item, like we reviewed the TMO, like we reviewed the budget. So I think that's something I regret. The other thing I think which is really apparent to me, especially rereading all of this story from beginning to end, is that whilst when we were looking at particular matters, we were dealing with them, I think, appropriately within the very narrow scope of thinking of them from a council perspective, I don't think we saw the bigger picture, and I don't think that we really addressed the emotional side, and I think we lacked a little humanity. And I would like to apologise to the people involved for that. I think we could have done better.
Thank you.
Mr. Marshall, thank you very much for attending to give evidence today.
Mr. Marshall, before you go, let me thank you, if I may, on behalf of all three members of the panel for coming to give us your time and your account of what went on. It is really very valuable to us to hear directly from those who were involved at the time. And so we are very grateful to you for coming to give evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. You can go to the usher then. Well, now, Mr. Kinnear, do we have any more witnesses for today?
No more witnesses for today, sir. We will start tomorrow with Mr. Mackover, with your permission. And
That would be 10 o'clock tomorrow?
10 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes, good. Right. Thank you. Well, then in that case, we'll close for today and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow and look forward to the next witness then.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much.